I'm going to be doing a talk that will relate to another talk. Greg Salmieri and I will be talking at the conference. We're working on a book on political philosophy. So we're going to be talking about some of the crucial issues about freedom or liberty from Rand's perspective and relating it to the Enlightenment, because the great movement for political freedom occurred during the Enlightenment. That's when political freedom as an ideal came into existence, I think. And thinkers were thinking very systematically, very carefully about how do you construct a society that would be free, and in particular, how do you remake government so that you have a government that is protective of people's freedom and doesn't violate it. We will likely talk some about the role that property rights play in the both an understanding of freedom, of why they're fundamental to the whole thinking about rights. And if one thinks about what happened after the Enlightenment, and part of what does it mean that freedom was no longer the crusading ideal in the 19th and into the 20th centuries, though there's still a lot of talk, obviously, about freedom. But freedom as it was conceived in the Enlightenment and gave birth to the American Revolution and the new country, the United States of America, there was an intimate tie between other rights, so freedom of speech, freedom of thought, for instance, and property rights. And they were seen as aspects of a total. And the attack on rights, and so on freedom or liberty, begins really with an attack on property rights. So we'll likely talk a bit about that. And if you think, for instance, the rise of socialism and then communism in the 19th century, their particular target when one's thinking at a sort of political science or political philosophy level, their particular target is property rights. The property rights are wrong, and we should abolish them if you take the Marxist communist slogan. And that means you're losing freedom, a proper conception of freedom or liberty as the political ideal. This divorce of that you can split rights apart and that you can talk about freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of association, to take some of the things from the First Amendment, and not talk about property rights. That has nothing to do with property rights. That is an enduring view. So to the extent that people even take seriously today freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of association, they don't think of it in terms of property rights. And in the end, you can't make sense of any of those notions if you divorce them from property rights. So the attacks on big tech is they're somehow stifling people's freedom of speech. But if you thought, well, but partly what freedom of speech means is the freedom to use your property to articulate and advance your ideas, the things you want to discuss and so on. Shouldn't people who have created big companies, vast platforms and so on, shouldn't they have some kind of power to say, this is what we're going to have on our platform, this is what we're not going to have on our platform? How is that a violation of freedom of speech rather than the exercise of their freedom of speech and your freedom of association? You can be on the platforms and you say, no, I don't like the terms in which they're governed, I don't want to be on the platform. But to have that kind of perspective, you have to see property rights and the issue of freedom of speech, or the right to freedom of speech, as interconnected. And it's not thought of in that way. The protests are another thing, I mean, that we're witnessing all around us right now, is freedom of association means freedom of association on your own property. It does not mean the right to clog the streets, is one of the ways Ayn Rand put it, but even just march on public property. If you think of Portland, to interfere with downtown, interfere with people's freedom to go about businesses, to get customers, and the customers aren't scared, like, what's going to happen if I go to this restaurant or this store late at night? And so that, if you thought of it again in terms of property rights as well as these other things, I think you would have a very different view and a better view of what freedom really means and what are interferences with people's freedom.